Welcome to Mindfall, where the questions twist and turn. Dive deep with us, we'll watch ideas burn. Down the rabbit hole we go, chasing thoughts you've yet to know. Mindfall's here, let's start the show.
Hi, and welcome to Mindfall with Mike and Mike.
I'm Mike.
And I'm Mike. In this podcast, we explore ideas that take us down the proverbial rabbit hole, and we ask and answer the hard questions with the help of an AI search engine.
Mike, what's our hard question of today?
Well, I've always been fascinated with biofuels and alternative fuels, and maybe it's that biologist part of me, but what if the Industrial Revolution was powered by renewable fuels and biofuels instead of fossil fuels?
Wow. That would definitely change everything as we know it in the world. In anticipation of this question, I looked up a few facts just to see before we got started on biofuels, because some people might ask, well, what's a biofuel? And I'm thinking that biofuel, we're either talking about solar power, I mean, that's also renewable, wind power, and hydroelectric power. Things of that nature that are, nature's providing the source of this energy.
Yeah, those are all standard renewables.
Standard. I mean, not anything crazy.
No, but if you want to dig into like some of the biofuels, those are more like ethanol, which is a byproduct of corn, or soy-based products. So you can use soybeans and the oils that are based off of that and go through a chemical extraction. You can make diesel
oil.
Yep. You can use hemp. So basically, any oil you can use and refine to an extent to make a fuel for an engine, whether it's a traditional diesel engine, a Stirling engine, or a gas engine, or a turbine, or your steam. They can all be used to fuel engines like we think of them today, just in a different extent. And you can even carry that further and look at biomass. So something as easy as our food waste or our excrement, it can all be gathered together, and what comes off of that is methane. And so collecting the gases off of that and reusing those for other purposes. So, in the Industrial Revolution and the times before, we had sources of fossil fuels. So there were small non-production wells of oil or pitch or tar that were used for different purposes.
That's been around for a long time, by the way.
Yeah. Yep. And it really wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we really started digging into how could we capitalize off of those products. And the early oil wells that were discovered, and a lot of them here in the U.S. that were discovered in Pennsylvania, were found to produce high amounts of oil. And then they figured out how to start breaking that down and into its constituent parts, such that you can have gasoline, you can have some of the cleaner burns, you can pull off the natural gas off of it, and you could use the other byproducts for different things like asphalt and maybe even cosmetics. So that's where the fossil fuels really comes into it. But what if we hadn't found those deep sources and technology just needed to advance, and somebody, instead of drilling a hole in the ground, said, hey, we've got these oil products that come off of corn or soybeans or these other things, and we can use them to fuel these engines that we're also starting to start to play with. What if we take those and start mashing them up together and really start finding a purpose for them?
Well, did not Henry Ford build like one of his first Model AT, I can't remember which one, that was based off of hemp oil?
Yeah, the early production oil engines that Ford was designing were, I think, hemp oil powered. And Rudolf Diesel, the diesel engine, the namesake, he designed the diesel engine not as a industrial workhorse for the world to go into trucks and trains and boats, but more as a very simple engine that could be deployed into areas that didn't have readily available sources of fossil fuels, where they had natural oils, peanut oils, corn oils, or other natural products, because that engine was very simple and could use those oils to function. So we have that history, but the problem is the production of fossil fuels happened at the same time as the development of these engines and these products, and it really changed the world.
I did a little research, and it said that the first refinery was, I want to say, 1850s, and it was used to for oil for candles for, I guess, in somewhere in Romania or something like that. But from that point, when they got their stuff going, I think it was like 1857 or something like that. Right after that, the United States started getting into it, and the rest of the world. And the line is exactly what you just said. This is at the exact same time the combustion engine is starting to show its face.
Yeah, there was a lot of serendipity there, and getting the multiple pieces to work together. But what if that just didn't happen that way? A lot of history is, oh, this happened and this happened at the same time, and it turned into what we have today.
So what's the question we want to ask our friend ChatGPT today?
Well, let's go over and drop right in. I want to know, what if the Industrial Revolution was powered by biofuels and renewable fuels instead of fossil fuels? I even asked the question, but I haven't looked at the answers yet. So, it's basically what our response is here is that we'd have a change in technology, a change in politics, a change in how cities and landscapes are developed, our environment would change, and even our culture would change because of our what's traditionally been our dependence on coal, oil, and natural gas. And so if we looked at the energy sources, we used alcohol from veggie oils, wood gas, and wind and water sources. Our engines would have been smaller and distributed. You wouldn't have had the big giant petroleum-based fueled engines that were really developed as part of the Industrial Revolution. And you'd see more use of windmills, hydraulic networks, and bio-powered engines to spread that into the landscape, into the less urban areas, into the rural areas. And you could spot place those a lot easier because they're based off of the resources you have around you. And there were some microgrids that were developed, but they really just they weren't seen as viable and competitive against the growing prevalence of oil, gas, and coal-powered engines and products.
I think part of, I mean, not including steam, of course, in this, but I think part of the challenge, though, is when you look at oil, although it might need to be refined, or coal, you're taking something that was already ready to go. Yeah. When you have some of these biofuels, okay, well, if I want to use corn and get ethanol, I got to still grow that crop, and it's like, how long does it take from a time period to grow that crop? And then when we look at the United States, because most of our conversations like the United States,
yeah,
our growing season for certain crops is limited. And then the amount of land and space and time you would have to do these things, rotate the crops, and then because corn is like in almost every processed food that we have, corn syrup. So
absolutely.
Where would that divide happen, or maybe corn syrup doesn't become a thing? Who knows?
That corn product might have been used. It might have been such a heavy commodity and used in the production of the fuels locally that using the syrup elsewhere and having the surplus of that product wouldn't have been available.
But is the syrup the ethanol? That's what I don't know this, but I feel like the corn syrup, because of the sugar, the energy from the ethanol, to me is one and the same.
Yeah, you are.
I mean, I don't know what
you're using, that corn sugar, and you're picking, right, do we develop that corn sugar into corn syrup, or do we take that corn sugar and ferment it over and turn it into ethanol? So you have to pick the path. Again, you were talking about the U.S. economy. Our mindset and our frame of reference is the U.S. So where oil was developed or oil was found is kind of where our urban centers have grown, right?
Or coal.
The first oil wells that were really produced were in central Pennsylvania and western Pennsylvania, and they fed the East Coast. They fed the Northeast. More oil wells that were found down in Texas, and that pushed the development of the Gulf Coast. Then some more oil wells that were found out in California, and that further fueled the development of the West Coast. More oil and natural gas found in Alaska, and that fueled more development down the West Coast. So most of our oil isn't necessarily found in the breadbasket where our crops are grown. We have less urban density in those areas, and if we expand that, across the world, we don't have a lot of urban density in our high agricultural areas or greener parts of the planet, because they're not necessarily viewed as rich, because we don't depend on the green, we depend on the oil. So the Middle East is really rich because of its oil.
I would also add that a lot of these things are on coasts because of the transportation of the product. I mean, you can truck something but so far, but you can take a tanker and you really transport a lot of the raw material to refineries or wherever you're going to take it a lot easier than you could by just taking, because when you're taking it by truck, you're still using a considerable amount of more fuel to do that because of the weights and all the other times and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, but if you look at some of the alternatives, rather than looking at bio-based fuels, if we relied on geothermal, wind, and hydraulics as our energy source, then your development is focused around where your energy source is as well. And if it's wind, we can get that pretty much wherever we have a good wind source. Right now, if you look at where they're putting windmills, they're out in the plains where you get a pretty steady wind. There are some mountaintop ones, but they're not as prevalent as some of those, the Midwest and the plains areas. If you base around hydraulic type sources, use your rivers to generate your hydro sources of energy, maybe that's where your development is based, because your energy is right there. And geothermal, you could use geothermal to heat up water and basically do that anyway. So I think our industrial development would have happened a lot differently and be spread around into probably smaller centers, and maybe not to have some of these bigger cities.
I think we have not taken the money required to properly develop some of these biotechnologies or renewable technologies. And I only say that because when I look at solar, solar has been around. This guy named Charles Fritz made the first solar panel in 1883. It was not efficient. It wasn't that good. But you figure it's been around for damn near 150 years almost.
Yeah.
And we still haven't gotten to the point where it's super efficient. Whereas when I'm looking at it, if we put some of the research and technology into this, you can almost, get the cost down. Because, when you first get a product out there, obviously it's expensive, but as it gets cheaper as it gets older, per se.
Right.
But who does it behoove for us to get free energy? We have lobbyists down in D.C. that are pushing petroleum. Hey, let's do this idea. No, because it's going to mess their money up. If I could get free heat, I think you had told me you got a solar panel on top of your house for your hot water.
I do, and it works wonderfully. It's an older set. I'm sure it could be more efficient, but it feeds a big water tank that I have in the basement, and it provides the majority of the hot water for the house. And it collects. So right now it's the colder time of year. We're in November, and we're getting production off of the solar panels that come down, and it's a glycol loop, and it heats my water. It's great because I get free hot water instead of having to rely on either a gas source or an electric source.
But it's a one-time cost.
It is.
I mean, now granted, over I'm not sure how long these things last for, but it's initial one-time cost. Maybe it lasts 20 years. I don't know. But instead of I got to pay my gas bill every month to heat my water. That's where I was just like, well, are the powers that be against us in some aspect, because they're trying to control the narrative of how much in control of money? I'm like, hey, if we do this, we're going to lose a revenue stream.
Yeah, and I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist podcast, but we're not far off it sometimes. It's where the money falls. It's where the money goes. And having a defined revenue stream that you can count on is something that is going to be exploited anytime as compared to a renewable or what is viewed as a free energy source. So it's the same idea of food. Do we make the food, or do we rely on the best creator of food, which is nature? Which, you know, we could analogize that to your solar panels. Solar panels that you said Fritz was the guy's name?
Yes.
Why did we develop solar panels? To collect energy? Well, what's the best solar panel on the planet? A leaf. It's collecting energy and converting it to an energy source. It's converting it to food. So every time that we develop a solar panel, yeah, we want to make it energy because we want to feed into an existing grid. We're kind of working to reinvent the wheel and compete with the existing grid. But if our sources had been different, if we didn't have those prevalent fossil fuels back in the Industrial Revolution, maybe our energies, our mental energy and our industrial energy would have been focused on developing a fuel source that more emulated natural photosynthesis instead of electricity. So we became less food dependent because our crops produce the energy we need, and we could use that energy however we needed to. So it's taking another step and using the byproducts of the crops to create electricity at the same time as we're using the byproducts of those crops to create food. So we remove energy scarcity and we remove food scarcity.
I feel like this is a slippery slope because when I'm thinking about oil, I think, the Saudi Arabia and those guys got in the game big time in like maybe late 1930s or 1940s or something like that. I feel like it's about power because how many wars that I'm not going to say like World War One, World War Two. How many wars, all the wars, were fought? You got Ukraine, Russia right now over resources, and we're fighting over oil resources. But if you had biofuels, and we're just talking about land, are we going to have those same fights or solar power or hydro? We're not fighting them because those things are available to everybody.
Yeah, the Arabian Peninsula was carved up as a result of the World War One and World War Two. The colonialization determined who had the powers and how much influence they had there. And it wasn't until very recently that the colonialization of those areas was shed for the native populations to have control of their own countries. Everything with a grain of salt. So let's just look at why was colonialization an effort there? Well, it was because of oil. Well, why didn't colonialization focus? I mean, colonialization comes with its own weighted concerns and everything else, but why didn't we focus on the greener parts of the planet as the resource beds instead of the oil-based parts of the planet? Why don't we focus on Brazil or Southeast Asia, where the amount of green product is so much greater than anywhere else in the world?
I think it's also about where you look at, again, it goes back to power.
Yeah.
The United States has been around, obviously, since about 1776 or whatever, but those regions, when I look at Brazil and South America, not to say that they are not developed now, but it seemed like, to me, those countries were not as developed as other countries across the world. And that being said, that means you're not using the same amount of resources and other things that these other countries might be using. Because, I mean, what a better question might be is, like, when did the Industrial Revolution start in South America? How they could have been 10 years behind. They could have been 20 years behind, but we were already out the gate.
So do we want to trade off what we have of climate impacts for carbonization of our atmosphere for deforestation? Because if you really want to focus on what parts of the planet can produce the most of your energy based on using plants, then you're going to redevelop those energy producing lands. Anything between the Tropic of Cancer or Tropic of Capricorn, getting the equator right there in the middle, you're going to intensely develop those for fuel crops instead of natural forestation, natural development, natural plants. And so, again, you got a trade-off.
Yeah, because those are the growing zones, basically.
Right, right. So the geopolitics of the world would be significantly different because those areas that are traditionally viewed as quote-unquote third world parts of the country might be some of the most rich parts of the country because they have the areas that can produce the most resources if those fossil fuels hadn't been developed or found to be available.
But then,
Because it still takes a lot to get those fossil fuels out of the ground, you know?
but if we go back in time, although those areas might be the richest, when we go back to what you just said with colonization, do the Europe countries, the Spains, the Englands, the Portugals, do they send their ships over and say, just put their flag up like they have and say, this is my land? So although they might be separated by distance, those countries still might be run by the same leadership.
Yeah, and that's a very good question.
But then another question would be on top of that, though. Again, it goes back to how did those countries at that time, and we're going back to 1700s or what have you, 1600s. I mean, they were able to build ships. They had gunpowder. They had other stuff, but those other countries were not as quote unquote civilized. If those countries were civilized and had the same resources and guns and ships and whatever, would that change the dynamic of things?
Yeah. So what if that bio-based economy was used to change how the world map really looks, So that's kind of an interesting question. If you want to jump back over to our friend at chat, let me see if I can switch over here. So energy drives an empire. It's what we were just talking about. And if industrial revolution had been powered by biofuels and renewable fuels instead of fossil, the entire logic of colonialism, conquest, and global power would have changed. So land and water become the new oil. Photosynthesis replaces geology, which kind of kicks back to that whole idea of why do we rely on solar cells that are producing electricity instead of the best solar cells that are out there that produce photosynthesis. And then colonialization would target biomass capacity for sugarcane, palm oil, timber, and ethanol crops rather than mineral and oil streams. So instead of mining colonies, we have plantation empires on even a larger scale.
But let me pause. But go back to that one real fast. The plantation colonies on a larger scale.
Well, who's controlling the crops? So instead of oil barons, you have plantation barons.
But then, like when in our sort of history in the United States, we obviously had plantations, and it would be interesting because the North, at that point, although oil was not where it would be, because the Civil War was 1864, something like that, 1860s. It would be interesting because that whole Industrial Revolution, which is the coal, which they were using for their manufacturing,
and trains to get the products out of the South into the North.
That would have changed the whole landscape of everything because everybody would then be relying on the plantations for the energy.
Yes.
So would there have been a civil war in the United States? Because if it affected the North and the South, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day.
Well, but it's a thread that needs to be pulled, and that's why we have these discussions. Is how does the geopolitics of the world look if we don't have the stressors out there to say that we should focus on fossil fuels and changing the independence of slaves in America, but instead we see them as a greater resource value we should feed more into that than try to get away from it. Are we saying that a biofuels based economy means that we have slavery as a bigger result across the world? Because
that's the question I need chat needs to ask. You need to ask that to chat because I think it does.
Yeah.
I think it does because that is a machine that requires labor. And the problem is like as we were able to move past slavery, the machine and the Industrial Revolution, with the cotton gin and a whole bunch of other stuff took over. But those were using um, engines that were either diesel based or what have you.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump back over to our friend at chat and ask, would a biofuels based economy increase the prevalence of slavery in the world? And
The It's funny, like when we look at the whole Marvel universe, and you have all these different worlds and different paths, and like if this one little change would have changed everything.
yeah. And a deeply important question. Yes, biofuels based industrial revolution would almost certainly have enriched slavery longer and more widely than fossil fuels driven one we actually experienced. Now, I do have to caveat and say, large language model type research, so AI, ChatGPT based research, tends to be affirming. So you have to be very careful about your questions. And so it's more likely to say yes than no. And it's going to search for why that is a yes instead of a no. So you got to be really careful about how you're phrasing your questions. But in this instance, I think it's really important that we ask that question. And, if fossil fuels, say fossil fuels replaced human and animal labor. So coal and steam did the work that people would have been doing in a farming nature. So
Right.
coal and steam based power. You've got fossil fuels versus human fuels. And so we didn't necessarily need that. The more industrialized we became, the less we relied on that agrarian nature of our South, or even of the world's South, of the third world, where slavery had more of a prevalence. And
I would like to say something on this, though. I feel like, though, the invention of some of these industrial tools, these engines, these other things, it did change the landscape where I don't need people. Because, the one thing about a machine, it's going to sound crazy, it's reliable till it's not. That engine is going to work and work and work and do it the same way, blah, blah, blah. Whereas when you are dealing with human, you have error.
yes,
A more chance for error than a machine, robot, whatever, doing the same task over and over again.
yes,
So I feel like the time periods might have been delayed, but it would ultimately would have gotten there because they're going to have to produce more, and they would probably need the assistance of a machine to produce more. And, think about like if you said, okay, I'm going to go pick apples. Well, if I had some humans out there picking apples, takes a long time. Or I have this big machine that takes the whole tree and shakes the tree, all the apples fall off and it captures them and thing, and boom, to the next tree. Instead of me having to pick every single one of those apples individually.
Yeah, and modern agriculture is a lot different than agriculture 200 years ago, but a lot of that is fueled by the oil-based technology that we use to support that. So I think that the bigger extent of this question, and it's we've kind of sidestepped or slipped down a different slope, is not necessarily how our world economy would have changed, but what would our world look like from maybe from an environmental perspective, or
Definitely cleaner.
yeah.
Probably wouldn't have a hole in the ozone layer at this point.
Yeah, I think we would, to your point, I think our industrial development would still be as intense, but not at the rate. So where we had the mid 20th century was really industrial based. Our world hit its peak on industrial development in the mid 20th century before the introduction of silicon diodes and transistors and everything else to really start ushering in the technology age. I still think that time would have happened, but maybe 50 to 75 years delayed, or we might have seen the development of alternative technologies that that mean that we even went in a 100% different direction. But I still don't trust mankind to not destroy the world that we live in to its own benefit. So how far would we have just exploited the soil for the benefit of crops that produce fuels? I mean, how many dust bowls would have happened around the world and ecological disasters happened around the world before we realized that what we're doing isn't the best idea.
Well, but the world is vast.
Yeah, but interconnected.
On a side note, because we still had other fuels and sources of energy to talk about, but I did some research on this whole hydroelectric power, right? And surprisingly, it says here it is believed that Roman engineer Vitruvius in
Yeah.
4000 BCE created the first vertical water wheel. 4000 BCE. Right
Yep.
now, that's about 6,000 years ago from us. Said the use of the water wheel began in 300 BC. And then the modern hydropower turbines evolution started in the mid 1700s with the first hydroelectric facility in 1882. All I'm only saying that to say is you see how long it took for that technology from, I'm not even going to go with Vitruvius. I'm going to go just to the use of the water wheel. And, I know they were using it to grind wheat and, maybe use it for water wells and whatever. But
On the micro scale.
on a micro scale. But at the same time, I'm like, it took 1,500 years? No, well, I'm sorry, that's 300 before. 2,000 years? Or
Yeah.
whatever to get to the use of, hey, we can make power. And that's why I'm like, nobody was controlling those thoughts of that, but it was never thought to be used to say, hey, other than the typical, hey, this is a good way to grind wheat, with this big wheel. Okay. Well, instead of me taking a mule or something, I can use water because my mule died. But it stopped right there. And I think that's where I'm looking at some of these fuels and the biofuels and stuff. It got to a point, well, we'll stop it right there. It's too hard. Someone said this is too hard.
Yeah, so we would have explored less of the world, and there would be more parts of the world we just didn't punch into and reach into. And so the world itself is less developed, less industrialized, and all of that is potentially in the future.
Well, and the world itself might even been less people.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Who knows?
That's an interesting question. So what would the human population look like? What would the world population look like in this?
But you were talking about how many dust balls do we have, but really that's all indicative of how many people we have because we don't need to produce all this energy and fuel and food and other things if the people aren't there.
Yeah. So in our timeline, in 1800 there were 1 billion people in the world. 1900 there's 1.6, and by 2025 we're at 8+ billion people, right?
So 8 times.
Maybe if we follow an idea of having less mechanization, more manual labor, moving food around the world being slower, no cheap fuel to foster fertilizers. Oh, fertilizers, a lot of those are based on fossil fuel stocks. Nitrogen that we get out of the ground is turned back into fossil fuels and mixed with some carbon and everything else. So instead of being 8-ish billion, maybe we'd be at 3 to 5 billion. So we still would have grown, but at a much slower population rate. And because we're dependent on the land, instead of seeing the land as just something to occupy, it's seen as a resource that we need. We can't just turn a farm into a neighborhood like we do now. There's more farm preservation instead of urban sprawl. So food crops are keeping people alive. Fuel crops keep machineries and transport running, and the forest and ecosystem rejuvenate the soil, the water, and the climate stability. So all of those are working in concert, where we tend to look at things now as resources just to consume. So maybe our mindset would have been more on preservation instead of consumption.
It's definitely that's definitely a different mindset because we are all about consumption right now. The question I would have though would be is when I look at some of the byproducts of fossil fuels, you had mentioned tar and other things like that for roads and all that. Holistically, that also gets affected because on It would, because if could you imagine, if 95 was all gravel,
Yeah.
Jesus, and then or is not like rubber for your tires and all that. That's got petroleum byproducts in it to help make the rubber.
You can make it last longer. The vulcanization process required that they mix oil and pitch into the natural rubber in order to get it to last longer and not fall apart. Because if natural rubber falls apart very, very quickly because it's not UV stable.
And even with when I look at where we are today, when how much byproduct is in everything, like I'm sure plastics have some sort of oil byproduct, vinyls, there's just everything feels like it touches oil.
Yeah.
So in some way, or I mean, I'm going beyond just the transportation of it from point A to point B, but the extraction or whatever, all today uses oil. Now, could those biofuels do the same? I'm sure, but it was never, we would be living in the land of the diesel engine and not the typical combustion engine,
Yeah.
And I actually think diesel is better product, to be quite honest with you, but I'm not sure why we went with combustion.
That's a whole different slippery slope for us to dive down. If really got into cars years ago in the history of, after reading the history of Rudolf Diesel, he even died under auspicious circumstances where he was on a boat traveling
The Titanic?
to.
He wasn't the Titanic, was it?
But I'll just say he was traveling in order to pitch his wares and disappeared somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. He got on the boat and didn't get off the boat.
Many people have had their demise when they had a good idea and somebody else got, well, you're touching my money now. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
what's your final thoughts on this, Mike?
final thoughts are, I love the technology that we have. It allows us to be here today and have these type of questions and ask these things of AI search engines. But the environmentalist inside of me says, I wonder if life would have been different, but I'm also afraid of how life would have been different because of how much fossil fuels and those types of products have made our lives better, from everything from technology, but also back to medicine and health related products. So we wouldn't be here today probably because we wouldn't have the ability to push out medical products and life-saving vaccines and everything else across the world without the availability of the fossil fuels to really get us there.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I go back to the Back to the Future scenario where, Marty McFly goes back in time and changes a few things, and his life got a whole bunch better. So I don't know where the technology would have led us, because if we were forced down another pathway, we might have had to develop differently, but it doesn't mean we might not get to the same place. But
Yep.
I don't know. I do feel this, though, is that I feel like lobbyists and, billionaires have hindered the progress of certain technologies in order to maintain a certain way of doing things. They, again, I still feel like solar should be way further than it is. If that happens, hey, now your electric bill isn't what it is, because you're producing your own energy. Again, if this was all pushed maybe in the 60s and 70s during those whole oil embargoes and all that, maybe we wouldn't be right here today talking about, my electric bill is $500 this month because it's wintertime or whatever.
Energy independence instead of energy dependence.
But I don't think, this is my conspiracy hat on, I don't think they want us to be independent, because it is a matter of control in one sense.
Yeah. It comes down to money. Back down to money.
Everything is down to money. I feel like, in our last podcast, we had discussed, how much is enough? I don't know, because I still got to pay that electric bill.
Yeah. I really don't want to go into politics. I like to stay free of the politics, and I'd like to invite all of our guests that have been listening to us for the past couple episodes. If you have any other thoughts and want to share with us, leave us a comment or send us an email to mindfall.podcast@gmail.com. We love to hear your ideas, your thoughts, your follow-ons. and follow us on all the socials. Tell us what you think. We could be 100% wrong, and that's the greatest part about this. It's Mike and Mike just here having a conversation of what things might have been, where things may have gone, and the questions that most people have never really thought to ask. So with that said, make sure you share our podcast with our friends. Mike, any closing thoughts on your way out the door?
I agree with everything you just said. And for all of our new friends out here, please share. One day we're going to have opportunities for some of our people who ask some intriguing questions. You could be our guest, and we can add you into the conversation so we get another point of view and see where the mind fall takes us.
Yep. And to that extent, we do have a Patreon, and if you want to be a supporter of our podcast, it's really easy. We've got a couple levels set up in Patreon. If you want to be a basic supporter, it's at $5 a month or $10 a month. And if you really want to support us at $20 a month, hey, we're going to try to do some live streams here and there, and maybe have some chats that go along the side. We'll try to answer some of the questions as we go through the chat. But we really appreciate you guys.
Remember, eventually we're going to put out our shirts and hats and that type of stuff.
Yep. We'll get merch out there as we start really developing. We really support you guys, and appreciate the support you give back to us, and look forward to seeing you guys in the next episode. All right?
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Talk to you soon.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Welcome to Mindfall, where the questions twist and turn. Dive deep with us, we'll watch ideas burn. Down the rabbit hole we go, chasing thoughts you've yet to know. Mindfall's here, let's start.